Thank you, Stuart. It's
my pleasure.
Very nice meeting you. And as Laurent Vallée was saying earlier, he was joking about this title, Propaganda and Democracy, and the fact that these two words, although they seem antagonistic and contrarian, are not that unrelated. And all your work and all what we've seen in the documentary show that we are in a different world today, or we think we are in a different world from Edward's time. Is it really a different world? I mean, who would be? What would be his reaction if he came back today? He died when he was over 100 years old.
He was 102.
And 102. So he had no real involvement in the digital era. But what would be his reaction if he saw today's world with algorithm, with big data, with all the technology that has invaded every area of life?
Well, I think we're filled with ideas that everything is new. This is partly a product of wanting to feel that we are making some form of movement in life. It's also part of the way in which the media, particularly the news media, work, which is, particularly with having a 24-hour news cycle, part of what the media do is that they rely on every day being new. That's why they call it news. And the result of that is that it tends to, at the same time that it promotes a fascination with the novelties of the present, it also obliterates, and each day consumes the previous day's news, and it generates a kind of historical amnesia, which I think may stand in the way of our ability to see Edward Bernays riding on a horseback within our midst. Bernays, I think, would feel very pleased that the technologies, for example, that are being used with big data in order to diagnose people's inner feelings through their behavior online, he would feel, well, this is what I was looking for. Back in the 1920s, I was concerned with understanding, first of all, what are the motivations that drive the public or the masses. I was also interested in understanding there's a French sociologist from the turn of the century named Gabriel Tarde, who wrote about opinion and conversation. And one of the things he said, this was 1898, he said, people sit around a table and they're having a conversation, and they believe that they're just the two or three of them having a conversation, but in fact, the role of journalism and the role of the media have reached such a point that their conversations are no longer their own. Their minds and their words are following what he called the grooves of their borrowed thoughts. And I think, so very early on, Bernays was somebody who was looking for the railroad tracks, so to speak, or the networks along which perception follow through society. The use of big data, which has become a key word of the present, a key phrase of the present, is simply a refinement of something that Bernays was looking for in more primitive terms, say, when he began his work during the First World War.
So you believe that the fundamentals of his thinking, his theory, are still there, and that all we have changed is the tools, the scale, the ability to reach into people's minds and behaviors, but that it hasn't changed fundamentally the way things are.
In other words, if you're looking what the motivations are and what the strategies are, they have not changed except that the tools have changed. But I think what's interesting, I mean, Jimmy talked before about how Bernay's book, Propagande, was just published in France within the last 10 years. I should add that it was just republished in the United States within the last 10 years. Bernay's was a name, even though there's a story I learned when I was a student, that Beethoven and the philosopher Hegel were standing at the side of this road, and Napoleon rode by on a horse, and Hegel turned to Beethoven and he said, "We are witnessing the world's spirit on horseback." And Beethoven never spoke to Hegel again. I think that Bernay's, in many ways, represented the world spirit of the invisible wire pullers who are interested in sort of managing not so much public consent, but I was saying just when we were sitting over a table before, the manufacture of consent is in certain ways too gentle a way of putting it, because I think what it is about is the manufacture of obedience. And I think this is this is something that's an ongoing part of our world, and certainly within the United States. There's no way of understanding Trumpism without understanding it as the product of the manufacture of obedience.
We'll come to Trump, obviously.
Yes.
He's a big part of our discussion. But to continue on that aspect, when the internet and the tech companies started, they were seen as tools of freedom, of liberation, of changing this paradigm that you were describing. And particularly when you think of Google's motto, "Do no evil," how come we didn't see that at the beginning?
This is a complicated question because the internet was developed by the US military. It was not developed simply by a bunch of freedom seekers. There's a book that has recently come out in the United States, the title of which has escaped my old mind, which deals with this sort of strange interrelationship between militarism and the uses of the internet. But yes, I mean, I think what a lot of people saw was that the internet created the public square once again, where everybody could participate in discussions. These were fundamental to the ideas of democracy as they evolved in the 18th century, here in the United States and elsewhere. But I would say France and the United States very much so. The difference, of course, is that the internet is a public square of isolated individuals. And so the relationship between that public square and the possibility of public awareness as a public and public discussion and public activism is complicated, because you have people sitting in front of their screens witnessing history in a very isolated kind of way. So at the same time that it offered the possibility of a kind of interaction that was previously unimagined, it also created an increasingly insular and isolated and individuated public, which I think represents a tremendous problem in terms of our future.
But who would be the Edouard Bernays of today? Would he be a computer engineer who designs algorithm?
You know, one of the reasons why Edward Bernays is of interest and got translated into French in the last 10 years and has been translated into English, has been published again in English within the last 10 years in the United States, along with his earlier book, which was called Crystallizing Public Opinion, which came out in 1923. One of the reasons why Bernays is being republished is because he speaks to the current generation. That is to say, I know a lot of young people who are involved in contemporary forms of persuasion and influence, who go back to Bernays as, in many ways, you want to talk about the Pope, you know, as the primate of the holy primate of persuasion. One of the reasons why Jimmy's film resonates today is because, in many ways, Bernays is, as I said before, he's the world spirit of our times. He wasn't alone. There were many people like Bernays. One of the reasons we know about Bernays is because he wrote about himself. He was unlike most PR people who like to keep behind the scenes, Bernays was a self-promoter. He wrote a book, beyond these books he wrote in the 1920s, he wrote an autobiography, which was called The Biography of an Idea, essentially taking this whole idea of propaganda and making it his own. But Bernays was part of a generation of people who had worked in the military propaganda machine, which was called the Committee on Public Information during the First World War. And what happened during that time was people who were media people, persuasion experts, publicists, journalists, filmmakers, public speakers and so forth, all got recruited into the Committee on Public Information, which is called in the movie the Creel Commission, after the man who was its leader. The Creel Commission was dismantled 7 days after the armistice, but you had a whole bunch of people who had come out of localized journalism, filmmaking, radio, etc., who now understood how to apply their craft on a grand national and international scale. And so you had the emergence during the 1920s of what one scholar of the field has called the compliance professions. Bernays was a representative of his time. He wasn't simply a lone individual. The reason why I think he's become so prominent is because most of them knew better than to talk about what they were doing. But Bernays speaks to the present very much. And as I said, the young people I know who are working in guerrilla marketing, virtual reality, data management, and so forth, these are people who are looking to Bernays. That's the readership. It's why it's getting published again.
You mentioned Donald Trump, and his victory opened the gates to many questions, many debates that are at the heart of our global discussions today about fake news, obviously, about manipulations, about post-truth. You know, these concepts came out of I mean, they existed, but they became a public debate issue after Trump won. The alternative facts, that was another one of those concepts. What is going on? What has Trump started, when we're dealing with Edward Bernays about manipulations, about shaping public opinion? What what does Donald Trump tell us about that?
Well, I think one of the central things about Trump is that he's turned the world upside down. That is to say, truth has always happened to ideas. Journalism is not simply a scientific gathering of data which is then presented to the public at large in a completely objective form. Journalism has always had motives and visions behind it. So, and 100 years ago, the American philosopher William James wrote a book called Pragmatism, in which I talk about in PR, and I say I talked about in PR. I wrote that book 22 years ago, and look, here I am. One of the things that he wrote in his book about pragmatism, he says, it was a chapter called Pragmatism's Concept of Truth. And in it, he says, truth is not the result of something that is inherent within it. Truth happens to an idea. It is made truth through a process of presentation and verification. And it was an important insight because on the one hand, it was a very democratic idea, this idea that we should not accept the truths that have been passed on to us by popes and kings. But on the other hand, it opened up the idea that if truth can happen to an idea, then if you say it enough, it will become the truth. Now, for a long time, in the United States, institutions like the New York Times, CBS television, various other Washington Post, and so on, these were institutions that carried the imprimatur of truth. I've been looking at the New York Times International edition. It's very different than the one we get at home. It's more critical in certain ways than the one we get at home. But also, one of the things that's missing from it is that on the top of the masthead of the New York Times in the United States, on the left side, on the right side is the weather, and on the left side is a box which says all the news that's fit to print, okay? So what it means is that for a long time, there was these certain authorities who were looked to in certain ways as the presenters, not of God-given truth, but of research-given truth. And there was a certain kind of arrogance that went along with that. It's very different than a place like France. We never had Libération, okay? We never had a journalism that was truly diverse in terms of, it's just like we don't have parties that are truly diverse. We have two sides of the same coin in terms of the political system. So what Trump did was to, as I said, he flipped the world upside down. He turned the mainstream arbiters of truth into purveyors of falsehoods, which to some extent was true. I mean, the New York Times sold the Iraq War to the American people by presenting journalism that was packaged by the US military. And it was only 2 or 3 years after that began that they
did an intense self-criticism for that.
Yes, where they began to criticize themselves for purveying the idea about weapons of mass destruction and this, that, and the other thing. It was a puppet show. So what Trump understood was that if you have a system where there are always puppeteers involved in the presentation of news, and where particularly certain sectors of the American public felt very eliminated from or amputated from the vision of truth that was being presented in those media, it was very easy for many people to see the mainstream media the commercial media, all of which work for the business system, which had collapsed internationally to some extent in 2008, to see that as a propaganda machine. And so he took the term propaganda, or fake news, which is, I guess, another terminology, and shown it as a spotlight on the mainstream media.
Does that mean that in that narrative, Trump would be like a resistance movement to Edouard Bernays and the fabrication of consent?
I don't think so. I think what he would do is understand Bernays better than the New York Times would have.
Yeah, so he took them at their own game.
Well, you know, you were talking in the beginning about the terminology of propaganda and democracy. And there are a lot of these apparent contradictions that live within our world. I mean, there's a writer in the United States who actually came and lived in Paris for a period of time, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote a wonderful piece of journalism called The Case for Reparations, which is a history about policies that underpinned the systems of racism in the United States, and particularly regarding black folks. And one of the things he talks about there is the extent to which democracy and white supremacy were bedfellows. And that's, I think, probably true in France as well as in the United States.
We're not very different.
What?
We're not very different.
No, I mean, and colonialism and U.S. imperialism are simply different moments in a long trend. So the propaganda was developed because of democracy. Bernays was interested in, since people had the arrogant idea that their ideas mattered and that their own thoughts mattered, Bernays realized that old systems of rule no longer functioned. The aristocracy, the ecclesiastical hierarchy, they were no longer relevant. And so what was necessary was the creation of unseen engineers who would use scientific tools, and he spoke about it this way, as a way of managing democracy so that people could believe that their own voices were being heard, and at the same time, executive power would be able to do what it wanted at this. What Trump has done is that he has attached his politics to certain feelings that are widely prevalent in the United States. Going back to what I said about Coates, the idea of white supremacy is something that offered even the poorest white folks a sense of superiority, a sense of mattering in a way that other people, dark people, didn't matter. It offered them a sense of importance. And part of what has happened in the period following, I would say, the Second World War, but very dramatically in the 50s and 60s and 70s, was that these previously submerged points of view all of a sudden began to gain a voice. Books were being published by people who previously were thought to be illiterate. And Trump understood the resentment of that. And he himself is a product of that resentment. Trump's father, who was where he got the money from, was a real estate guy who banned black people from living in all of his housing projects, but who also marched with the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. In other words, Trump came from a family that was dedicated to white supremacy. So the ability to call Mexicans rapists and criminals is no different than what the Klan said about emancipated black people in the late 19th century. So Trump, and what he does, and this is something that I assume you've seen, when Trump, unlike any politician I have seen, when Trump speaks, and he holds rallies all the time, I've never seen a president holding rallies every 2 days. And in these rallies, he goes to places which are friendly to, I would say, his ideas about giving power to the powerless, defending white supremacy against the encroachment of otherness that was turning America into an unrecognizable place. And he gives these speeches, but every time he gives a speech, he also recruits people to stand behind him. So whenever you see him in a rally, it's not just Trump at the podium, but you see hundreds of people behind him who have all been coached by an advanced person to cheer madly at everything he says, and who also have been, I would say, tattooed with small representations of diversity. So you will see one black face, and that black face is on top of a body that's wearing a white T-shirt that says "Blacks for Trump." You'll see a couple of women, despite the kind of misogyny that runs through his movement, who are women for Trump. But for the most part, it is a bunch of truckers in red hats saying, "Make America great again," which, by the way, means to a lot of people, make America white again. Let's make America something that has done away with the history. So in many ways, this is the use of that symbolism of being a man of the people and actually having the people behind you on stage. I mean, that's remarkable. And whether it's done out of intuitive genius, or which I think is the case. He's not an intellectual. In fact, he appeals very deeply to the anti-intellectualism that is part of the lifeblood of American society.
So would he be doing Edward Bernays without having read Edward Bernays?
He probably knows somebody who read Edward Bernays. But for the most part, his style is, in American popular culture, you all know this because of the movies. In American popular culture, there are two genres which have been dominant. One of them is the Westerner. And the thing of John Wayne or others. And the thing about the Western is it highlights the individual who answers to no one but himself, and certainly is in some way a representation of libertarian behavior, not just, and he'll kill anybody in his way, and that's part of the ugly charm of the Western tradition. The other tradition is gangster movies. And Trump comes out of a gangster movie. You have to realize, he came out of the building industry. Anybody who has spent enough time in New York to watch how the building industry works knows that the building industry historically, along with a few other industries like sanitation and so on, private sanitation, not public, have been run by the mafia or by other mob organizations. And so if you're going to do business in New York, you need to know who to pay off. And you need to know who to trust and who not to trust. And there is a kind of sacred bond that begins to develop between those and the people you're paying off. And that sacred bond is predicated on the idea that you'll pay them off, but if they ever turn on you, you'll have them wiped out. As people around Trump have begun, under the investigation that's going on, turning on him, he's using mob language to describe the people who are turning on him. This guy's a loyal guy. He's a good guy. He's a good fellow. This one's a flipper. I don't know how those translate into French, but this is the lingo of gangsterism. And anybody who works in certain businesses in New York, and this is true for a long time. I grew up with these kids, okay? A lot of my friends, their fathers were gangsters. I grew up in Queens for a long period of time. This is where Trump comes from. It's a world that's permeated by gangsterism. I understand it intimately because I work at a university that is part of the city of New York political system. And I saw payoffs going on within the university where deans were handing money to obedient professors, you know, and for nothing. Just, you know, you and my friend, we have drinks together after work. Okay, here's $100,000. Have a good time. So it's part of the culture. And Trump appeals to that because in the gangster stories, just like in the Western stories, the murderers are always the heroes. You know, the killers are always somewhat romantic. And the fact that he puts on a red baseball cap, which has become, you know, a sign of trucker culture, which also is an industry, the Teamsters, sure, which has a long history of criminal association. And as what's turning out to be the case is that he surrounded himself with, in draining the swamp, he surrounded himself, you know, with the swamp.
One of the most striking aspects of today's American scene from here at least is the polarization, is the fact that Americans don't read the same news, don't believe the same sources. You're either Fox News or New York Times, and so the basis for society, for community, doesn't exist anymore. Is that something that Trump is using?
I think it's something, first of all, that has been happening the minute they replaced fireplaces in homes with televisions, which, by the way...
You're a great pessimist then, huh?
I'm not a pessimist. I'm an optimist, because I think there is... Change is difficult. We talked about this the other night. We live in a world, certainly in the United States, where people are used to instant gratification. They want change and they want it now. As a historian, one of the things you see is that change takes time. And I think that alongside of this division of society and the use of big data in order to systematize that has been widely noted. But along with that, there is a widespread dissatisfaction with that. And so one of the things that has happened, whereas when Trump goes to Michigan or wherever he goes and has the crowd cheering behind, they've been coached to cheer behind him. When the reporters come to them and say, could he ever say anything that might upset you? People actually say, no, I believe everything he says. So this is not a group of people who are even democratically oriented. They're people who are in love. This is, you know, they have projected onto him the very things that they've been feeling, but feeling embarrassed to say. They project onto him the things they say missing from their own lives, but simultaneously, the population of the United States is changing. There's massive organizing going on a local level. People are meeting together in ways that I find very promising. The fact that a socialist or a few socialists have been reached positions of power in the United States, this is something that has not happened in 100 years, where there were a couple of So
who are you referring to? To those who won the
Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez,
the primaries in the Democratic for the midterm.
Yeah, and in New York, no, a Republican is. I mean, that's the other thing about Trump that's so interesting. He is hated in his own city. In other words, we've received a big dose of Trump, going back to the time where he was, a playboy on the cover of the Inquirer magazine. People think very poorly of him. In certain ways, he fits a sort of American mythology of the city slicker who comes into small town America and hoodwinks, the ordinary people. Only this time, the ordinary people like it. But there are other things that are going on. I mean, there was a story, recent research into the population of the United States. In 2018, the percentage of the population that is foreign-born is greater than it has been in the United States since 1910, which was in the middle of the great migration of people from the Mezzogiorno of Italy and from Eastern Europe and so forth. And those people were defiled as well. And Trump, in certain ways, is echoing the outlook of the anti-immigrant forces, powerful anti-immigrant forces of that time. The people who were promoting eugenics as a way of trying to undermine the fertility of lower beings, and also attempts, very successful attempts, particularly aimed at black folks, to discourage them or keep them, often violently, from voting. And that stuff is, so in many ways, I think Trump is a throwback to the kind of demagoguery that Bernays was inspired by, or that Gustave Le Bon was inspired by. He's not a technocrat. He's not somebody. Okay.
Sorry, but it's to follow on what you just said. In the last pages of your book, PR, you're an optimist about the influence of education, about media literacy, about the fact that compared to the beginning of the 20th century, there is obviously a much greater access to information, to knowledge, that is more democratic and open. And then in the past 20 years, we have this feeling that we are going backwards.
History doesn't just move forward. That's part of the Enlightenment idea of progress. But I would say two things, and one in terms of the last. If you're going to end a book about the powers of persuasion, you also want to encourage, and the wire pullers who stand behind the instrumentation of persuasion. I think it's only fair to encourage your reader to believe that there is a possibility of something better. Because media studies, if it's only about all of the ways in which the media fuck with our minds, excuse me. In America, we would say, pardon my French, but but if that's all you do, then in certain ways what you do is you encourage a sense of powerlessness. And one of the things about a sense of powerlessness is that it makes people powerless. So it's critical for people to imagine their own potential power, not as individuals, but as people, as earthlings.
Yeah. But media literacy is a very interesting topic because, I mean, we're talking a lot about it in France. That the government announced that it was doubling the budget for media literacy in schools, for example. It's seen as a way of countering fake news, conspiracy theories, and creating better citizens for the future. There's no real evidence that it works when you look at the US.
Well, first of all, we have to look at the question of literacy and what it means. Does it mean, as some people in the business sphere in the early part of the 20th century said that you needed to teach workers how to read so they could follow orders better? Literacy has a history. Most people historically have not had literacy. And the reason why literacy became an issue, particularly in social movements of the 19th century, 18th century, and even 20th century, was because literacy is not simply, when we're given literacy, or kids in the 19th century were introduced to literacy, it wasn't so they would be able to understand all the lies that were being told to them in the books they read. In other words, yes, that's something you need to be able to look out for. You need to be able to understand the way in which rhetoric, on the one hand, if properly used, can enlighten people. If improperly used, it can mask reality in ways that will have people acting against their own best interests. But literacy, the idea of literacy, and the movements for alphabetization, the movement towards literacy, one of the reasons why it has been such a fundamental part of popular social movements is to broaden the universe of discussion. The idea was not just to learn how to read, but to learn how to write. And with the idea that learning how to write would in fact broaden the range of ideas that came to light. The ideas of people who have been historically silenced by what we call the record of history. And so I think while it is true that we're in a dark time in terms of the development of or the uses of mass psychology to mobilize people in ways that are very dangerous. Simultaneously, this is a period of time where there's an explosion of writings that are giving voice to ideas and that have not been heard before. I mean, I mentioned before Ta-Nehisi Coates. His essay on the case for reparations takes the sort of institution of racism, the murder of black men by police, that's part of the everyday news, and says, wait a second, this is not just something that's happening now. It's something that's happening because there is a history of policies that ensured ghettoization of black people. And in certain ways, it's about making the present legible through providing people with historical memory. And I think this is kind of one of the tasks of literacy, and it's something that's happening. Look at Jimmy's film. I mean, that's part of the universe of discussion.
But if I may, you've been very critical of the media in the US, and that would apply to France or Europe probably in the same way if you were living here. And some of that criticism is definitely legitimate and is shared by many people. But at the same time, the alternatives have not been coming out. The social media were seen at some stage, and I know because when we started our website, Agnès was referring to Rue 89, we had this idea that people would take over social media and produce not necessarily alternative news, but a wider and a better way of news. This hasn't happened.
No, it hasn't.
And today we are faced with a decredibilized, less credible media, I'm not sure I invented a new word. Less credible media and social media that have not been, that have become battlefields for rival ideologies or hate groups. And so we're left with a less reliable and less credible news system.
Yeah. Well, I think the news system has, on all sides, has contributed to that, because the very fact that each day you need to pump out another newspaper and that it needs to contain stuff that is new. I mean, and Trump is great at this. One of the things that Gustave Le Bon talked about when he talked about leaders in the late 19th century, I'm sorry to go backwards when you ask about the present, because I think memory is important. And I think the loss of memory and the kind of diminution of memory is one of the most dangerous things in our midst. When Ray Bradbury wrote his book, Fahrenheit 451, one of the things that had created that dystopic world was that nobody could remember anything. And the obliteration of memory is, so when Le Bon looked at the leaders of the late 19th century, Paris Commune, which is what really freaked him out, he said, well, the leaders, they speak as if in images, and each one is placed in front of the next one like a magic lantern show. And they have no connection to one another, and but they seem to they have no logical connection to each other, but they become a sort of pseudo-narrative. That's what Twitter does. Twitter is the magic lantern show, and the fact that we have a president of the United States who is on Twitter 10 times a day is a way of creating constant distraction from the world at large. But let me go back to what you said in the beginning. You said I'm a critic of the media. I am not a critic of the media. The media are tools of public expression. I am not a critic of the printing press. The printing press is something that can be used in emancipatory ways, and it can be used in repressive ways. And so the real question is, and I think this is the issue about literacy, that if we mean what we say about media literacy needs to encourage a public, first of all, to be able to look not just at what the media information is or disinformation, but also how the very structures may keep them from achieving what they need in order to fulfill their democratic aspirations. And another thing that needs to be done is that we need to break down the distinction between author and audience. In other words, citizen journalism is something that has had a very positive impact, certainly in the United States. The murder of Eric Garner by a policeman in Staten Island, that's been something that's part of the American story. Policemen have been killing black men as long as there have been free black men. And even when there weren't free black men, overseers were killing them. So this is part of but now you have people who put that stuff out there. I think people need to imagine themselves as citizen journalists, and they also need to understand ways of coming together as a community. In other words, when somebody says, did an interview 2 days ago, and the interviewer said to me, well, what would you say to someone who said, I don't want to be manipulated? What would you say to someone who said, I don't want to be manipulated? And I would say, as long as you view yourself as someone, you are susceptible to manipulation. It's only when you understand yourself as an earthling, as part of a species that needs to discover itself once again. It's only when that happens that you can create media that are in fact critical and interactive, not interactive online, but interactive in the streets. I mean, the streets are very important because when people come together in the streets, power shakes. When people come together online, and the question, because again, is who controls the structure of the media?
And who controls the tech platforms?
The
Technical,
technical platform,
Facebook,
yes.
Google, Twitter.
Yes, and these are one of the things.
Are they allies or enemies in what you've just described?
Well, I think it's interesting because if you look at Silicon Valley companies, and I would assume, I don't know, I'm not conversant with the equivalent in France. But if you look at...
We use Twitter,
Okay.
Facebook.
Okay, but if you look at, because the Chinese have developed alternatives.
They were smarter.
But as long as the people of Silicon Valley are these interesting contradictions. They are very socially progressive. They tend to be socially progressive in terms of ideas of gender rights, in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of all kinds of things. And they support, in many ways, quote unquote, liberal causes. With one exception, the guy who's the head of PayPal is in
Peter
Trump.
Thiel.
Yeah, Peter Thiel was at least a Trump supporter. But other than that, these are people who were functionaries for Obama. But the thing is that they're staunchly libertarian. And they're staunchly libertarian in ways that, for example, when the government wants to regulate them in any way, they take the same position that the oil industry takes. They take the same position that other global monopolies have taken going back to the early days of laissez-faire. And so you have a situation in which you have a kind of transnational corporatism, which is the economic mindset of Silicon Valley, and the kind of what you might call lip service to libertarianism that functions on a more public level. But I was going to say, we'll just go back to a discussion before. The problem is that the people who are the owners, the captains of those industries, they understand the profit motive and they are driven by that. A lot of the people who work for them in terms of, computer engineers and so forth are libertarians without necessarily identifying with capitalist motivations. And so you have a person like Edward Snowden who comes out of that world, who broke with the policies of the NSA, but also of Silicon Valley.
But the Silicon Valley is the new backbone of American capitalism.
Yes, that's what it is. And that's one of the reasons why when we talk about creating alternative media, we need to find other channels, we need to build other channels. We need to probably go more low-tech, because high-tech invariably is connected to money and power. And sometimes, in the 1960s, one of the things that happened in the midst of all of the activities that went on was the creation in France of the Atelier Populaire, in the United States, the underground press, the military, even in the military, the foot soldiers, the people who were executing the war on the ground started shooting their officers and started producing underground newspapers with mimeograph machines.
but we're going the other way. I mean, Agnès was quoting Yuval Harari. He presents a future which is, artificial intelligence mixing with human brain and a kind of incredible tech future that is shaping our world and creating different types of inequalities and struggles in this world.
The question is, where do we find the alternatives? Now, part of the appeal of the brain-machine interaction is that there are certain people who are arguing that since our brains are simply computers, this comes out of Alan Turing, the computational theory of mind, where we view the computer simply as a facsimile of the way in which the brain actually works. There's no evidence of that. In other words, if you want to understand an apartment building, looking at the electrical networks and the plumbing networks really doesn't tell you much about the life of what goes on in that apartment building. But part of the appeal of it, part of the appeal of the brain-computer interaction is that there are people who are arguing that in the future you will be able to have your brain uploaded to a drive of some kind, and it will provide you with immortality. That is to say, your body will die, but your mind will continue and will be appended to a machine. Well, this is sort of high-tech Christianity. This is the promise of
life after life.
The promise of an afterlife. And I actually think one of the things that needs to be an urgent realization among people is their own mortality. Because once you embrace your own mortality, then you can find a sense of purpose within your life, what you do with your life. This is what your old boss, Jean-Paul Sartre, said, right? Life in and of itself only takes on meaning through engagement. Yeah. And I think that's true. And I think hoping for these technologically determined futures, there's nothing new about that. It's something that's been going on forever.
It's been a long time I haven't heard someone quoting Jean-Paul Sartre, I must say.
Excuse me. I'm an old guy.
We'll take a few questions from the audience in a few minutes. I have one last thing. I found this statistic which I found staggering. In 2000, there were 65,900 reporters in the US and 128,000 public relations people. So 1 for 2, more or less. In 2015, 15 years later, the number of reporters went down 1/3 to 45,800. And the number of PR people went up to 200,000 and 18,000. So it's now 1 reporter for almost 5 PR people. What does it say about our world? I mean, as a journalist, I must say I find that completely scary and mind-blowing.
Well, I think it's scary, but it also tells you that the urgency to manufacture consent has become increasingly greater. And the urgency of working with an informed public has become something that the structures of power are less and less interested in. So, in other words, you can look at statistics like that in a variety of ways. One way is that, people are just not interested in understanding the world that they live in. And the other is that maybe people are interested in understanding their world, and so you need to put more engineers of consent on the ground in order to be able to deal with those desires. Because I don't feel that people have lost their inquisitiveness. And I don't think that people have lost their anger about the inequities of power. And I should say, although Trump is this front man who kind of puts on a circus that's visible in the media globally, all on a daily basis. But behind the scenes, what's going on politically is horrific. It is something that's been part of a conservative plan within the United States, and I assume elsewhere, for a long time, but they never had, you know, the carnival barker before who could stand in front of the crowd and keep them distracted from the issues of their lives, because economic inequality is growing. The repression of popular sovereignty and voting is growing. The wages of blue-collar people are stagnant, while the income of the very wealthy, not just the 1%, but probably the 10%, you know, ensures that you have an upper middle class who will be the front people for conservative politics. But meanwhile, you have people in Appalachia who've been out of work, who are struggling with health issues, obesity, I mean, all kinds of problems, who are being led by the nose by this carnival barker. So, you know, I think that there are very real, and I think that I have run into people who have said, I would have voted for Bernie Sanders, but instead I voted for Trump because I didn't have a chance. And I think that's a sign of how manipulable people may be, and they can't tell the difference between one or the other. But it's also that there is this sort of repository of upset and feeling of being robbed of one's birthrights that can lead in different directions. What we're seeing right now is that led to the election of the impossible president. But you could, if you watched his rallies as early as 2015, it wasn't hard to see that he would become president because of the stuff that he brought out in people. You know, this telling people to beat up on anybody who criticizes him. Yeah, go. In the old days, we would have led them out on a stretcher. In the old days, go ahead, hit him in the head. I would like to punch you in the face. This is the president speaking. I would like to punch you in the face. And you know what? Punch him in the face. If you get if a lawsuit comes up against you, I'll get you my lawyer. Well, his lawyer is now up in charges, so it's a problem.
Thank you. We must have some microphones si vous avez des questions. Alors moi, je vois pas grand-chose, donc j'ai le projecteur dans le visage. Est-ce qu'il y a... Personne n'ose s'exprimer. Ah si, il y a une question au milieu.
Comments, anything?
Hi. You were saying in a film that people who started with this propaganda that they're not going to see the end of it. That's going to go for generation and generation. Who do you think the pair of this thing were? If you understand what I mean. Je suis pas français, mais je peux poser une question en français. c'est un peu compliqué. Dans le film, vous avez dit que les gens qui ont payé pour certaines choses de propagande, ça va aller pendant les générations. Je ne sais pas si vous avez pensé à quelqu'un en particulier ou pas.
That's an important question, in part because more progressive tendencies within our societies tend not to think across generations, where we have this desire for instant gratification. But I would say, if you want to talk about in 1936, when FDR runs for president, he makes war against the business class. He calls them the economic royalists, and that we're going to take their power away from them. You'll see a little bit of that in the film. And so beginning in the late 1930s, you have the coming together of various organizations. One of them mentioned in the film is the National Association of Manufacturers, which continues to be a major power in the United States. You have the Chamber of Commerce, which continues to be a major power in the United States. You also have a group of people who are interested in creating an identification between Christianity and God and capitalism. It's one of the reasons why on American Money it says, "In God we trust." That was something that started being promoted in the 1930s. It didn't reach the dollar bills until the 1950s. And you also had the development of organizations like the Pellerin Society or the Department of Economics at the University of Chicago, who saw the vitality of capitalism and the longevity of capitalism as being in danger. And they laid out plans that were, as I call it in the movie, the long game. In other words, even if we do not live to see what we are creating, we need to create it and trust in the fact that it will achieve its goals. Well, one of the people, to answer your question more directly, who was recruited initially by the National Association of Manufacturers, was a young Hollywood actor by the name of Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan, during the 1940s, became a spokesperson for example, against a national health care system, which was about to be passed. He then went to work for General Electric. He had a tutor, a person who would train him on these trips, and he would go from factory to factory arguing against unionism. And General Electric became one of the first major companies to develop strategies for union busting. Reagan then went on to television in the 1950s for General Electric. He was the host of a program called the General Electric Theater, and the motto of the program was General Electric, where progress is our most important product. By the 60s and 70s, he's been elected to the governorship of California. And in 1980, as you all know, becomes the President of the United States. And by the way, uses the engineering of consent in ways that were at least a premonition of Trump. He didn't have the kind of hard edge that Trump has, but he had very similar politics and represented similar politics. So that's an example of ideas that began to percolate in the 1930s that finally achieved state power on the presidential level in the 1980s, and which I would say have continued incrementally since then, particularly when you have, for example, the Democratic Party breaking from the very sort of tradition of social welfare programs that had been the legacy of the New Deal. So I certainly would view Ronald Reagan and now his sort of idolized ghost as an example of thinking about the long game.
Where do you draw the line between this idea that there is this engineering that is long-standing and very efficient, and the conspiracy theories, where if we are indeed manipulated somewhere, why aren't we manipulated on everything? And maybe no one went to the moon, maybe there was not 9/11, maybe, you know, all the theories that go around. Where do you draw the line, and how do you define that line?
Well, I have a whole problem with the phrase conspiracy theory, because anybody who has studied history knows that there are and have been conspiracies. I mean, the papacy was driven from Rome and sent to Avignon hundreds of years ago by a conspiracy. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln, while they were only successful in killing Lincoln, was a conspiracy to wipe out the leadership of the Union government by people who were former Confederates. The term conspiracy theory, I think, entered into this muddy world of, by the way, I don't think you can study history without acknowledging that people get together in rooms, some on Madison Avenue.
As we are doing now.
Yeah. Well, this was completely planned. In fact, neither of us are actually here. If you'll notice, each of us has a small key behind our right ear, and we were wound up sort of on the way down into the theater. My spring is running out, actually. But no, I mean, after Kennedy was assassinated, there were all kinds of quote-unquote theories about who did it. And of course, the official government position was in tune with American individualism. It was a lone gunman. There was no conspiracy. Don't look at the man behind the curtain. You know, it was a lone gunman who conveniently happened to be killed days after he functioned as a lone gunman, so that he could never divulge any of what might have motivated him. And so you had all kinds of people, often without much information, speculating on the fact that the killing of a president probably is not something that happens without some previous discussion. And so the term conspiracy theory became a euphemism for, crazy ideas. Well, I think that the way we can tell the difference is through inquiry. In other words, just as, one of the things that for me distinguishes good journalism from crackpot journalism is that good journalism is based on research, where you look around, you look under the rocks. Just like good history, you go through the garbage. You look for the stuff that like detective work. And I think people need to be able to recognize that. But I think that the fact that the term conspiracy theory gets thrown around promiscuously as a way of describing even Trump. Trump is filled with all these conspiracy theories. He saw a bunch of Arabs on top of a building in New Jersey who were cheering, when the World Trade Center went down. Well, he didn't see it. He wasn't in New Jersey. And that's stuff that can be found out. But I think wiping out the idea that groups of people function in concord with each other, in conspiracies, I don't think it's a healthy thing for us to ignore the way in which interconnected interests function in history.
Oui. Non, mais attendez, il y a un micro qui arrive, c'est nécessaire.
Donc, je voulais faire un petit retour en arrière sur la psychologie des lois Bernays. Bon, c'est un petit peu loin du sujet actuel. Parce que simplement, cet homme-là, il était assez intelligent, il avait tout pour lui, et il s'est mis au service de causes qu'apparemment il ne pouvait pas partager. Parce que faire la guerre contre l'Autriche et l'Allemagne, qui étaient ses pays d'origine, où il avait de la famille, c'était déjà assez délicat. faire manger du bacon et des œufs, je ne pense pas qu'il devait en manger lui-même, pour différentes raisons. Et la promotion de la cigarette, je ne pense pas non plus qu'il fumait. Alors, finalement, qu'est-ce qui pousse un homme à se mettre au service du pouvoir? Est-ce que c'est une espèce d'ivresse du pouvoir par procuration? C'est ça la question que je me pose. Alors l'autre question, qui est plus vaste, qui est autour, c'est le contrôle des populations. Donc en France, contrairement aux États-Unis, on a un État central fort. Donc la population est contrôlée depuis toujours, disons depuis 3 siècles. Ce qui n'est peut-être pas le cas aussi efficacement aux États-Unis. C'est peut-être pour ça que la démocratie américaine est peut-être plus efficace d'une certaine manière que la française. Mais actuellement, grâce au GAFA, donc je ne sais pas si c'est assez clair, la Silicon Valley, donc nous avons maintenant une espèce de contrôle général de la population en temps réel, qui est absolument extraordinaire. Et dernier point, quand vous avez évoqué l'immortalité de l'âme, en vérité, c'est déjà fait, puisque tous nos faits et gestes, nos moindres pensées, nos moindres hésitations, sont enregistrés en permanence. Donc, il n'y a pas besoin de payer pour ça, on le fait tous les jours, à tout moment.
Merci.
You've asked a lot of good questions in the midst of your question. Yes, I think he was intoxicated by the idea of controlling people. His daughter, Anne Bernays, who's in the film and who also I know, would sit at the table and say that everybody was stupid. You're stupid, he would say to his daughters. And so he believed that the intelligent few had a responsibility to democracy in order to ensure that the stupid masses could behave. And there was a lot of money involved. In other words, what makes people promote war against his country of origin? First of all, he was not, Bernays was not a major figure in the Committee on Public Information. This is his retelling of the story. Walter Lippmann and a guy named Arthur Bullard, who were both advisors to President Wilson, were the people who came to him. Wilson wanted to use force to shut down all opposition. And Lippmann and Bullard argued that we needed to create a propaganda bureau, and they became the architects of it. And they also chose a man named George Creel to head up the commission. George Creel had been a journalist who had done exposés of the Rockefellers' murder of miners at Ludlow, Colorado. So he was known as a critic of business, which was a very smart move in a war that was often being criticized as a businessman's war. So Bernays was a functionary within there. He certainly wasn't somebody who was an architect of the war against Austria. He was, like many American intellectuals, he was part of the twilight of the idols. You know, the people, the intellectuals who came into compliance with the war effort. In terms of what you said about immortality, I understand what you're saying, and that is that there is a record that is being maintained. It used to be that people were either dead or alive, and then they became recorded, okay? So which is kind of an intermediary place. And I know this because I was mentioning to Pierre before that when my father was dying, he was a very visual person and he went blind. And so my mother bought him a little tape recorder, and he would speak into the tape recorder every day about his bowel movements, about him being nauseous, about his dreams, about not wanting to feel morbid, about memories of him and his father going to the the baths downtown on the Lower East Side. And my son, who's an editor, put this together into a CD. So each of these little memories got turned into like a cut on the CD. And I had it on my iPod, and I was going to visit a friend. And I'm listening to music, and all of a sudden I hear my father speaking into my ear. And it was incredible. And I went to see this man who was a colleague of mine. And I said to him, Matt, you know, the weirdest thing just happened to me. I was listening to music, and then all of a sudden, my father started speaking to me, and I could hear his breath, and I could hear his voice. And it was so different than looking at a photograph, which is frozen and dead. It was actually, and so I understand that there is a kind of immortality that is possible through the, and he went on to me. He told me, he said, you know, my father died when I was 13, and I would give all of my photographs if I could have one recording of him speaking to me. So there's no question that there is this intermediary ground. But I think that what's different about the immortality that you're talking about, which is the kind of recorded data, is it's all about turning subjects into objects. In other words, the immortality is the immortality of an object. The subjectivity is gone. And I think that the myth that is being promoted about the kind of transfer of the brain onto a hard drive is about maintaining subjectivity, that your mind, your consciousness will continue. And in this case, consciousness simply becomes raw data to be exploited for other people's purposes. So I wouldn't quite call it immortality in the sense, say that some people wish for it.
Thank you for this piece of personal testimony. It was very, very, very meaningful to our topic also. We're going to stop that here before your machine stops. Thank you very much, Stuart, and thank you, everybody, for this great talk.
And let me say to everybody that this is one of the great pleasures of my life, to be here with you. I am a man in his middle 70s, and to know that, you know, ideas that I've been wrestling with since I was very, very young still matter, are still relevant, it's not about immortality, it's about engagement, it's about the purpose in life that your old friend Sartre wrote about. Anyway, thank you so much for being here.
Merci.